This first panel tries to break new ground in the study of differentiated integration by looking at actors that have not been that much in the focus of the study of differentiated integration. So far, work on differentiated integration has remained very much at an EU systemic level. Most of what we do is study legal acts or EU negotiations on differentiated integration, but there has not really been a systematic attention to, or very little of that, to citizens, parties, and individual countries and their attitudes, preferences, positions on differentiated integration. And one of the purposes of our consortium was actually that we wanted, let's say, to move down, yeah, from this very top systemic level to a more micro perspective on differentiated integration. And the three papers that will be presented in our first session, they all move in that direction and provide first results of our research. So just briefly to introduce, the first paper will deal with parties. And this is a paper by Richard Bellamy, Sandra Kröger, and Marta Lorimer, and it will be presented by Marta in just a few minutes. The second paper deals with the country level and ask the questions, what do governments think about differentiated integration? Actually, as you will find out, the paper is much, in some ways, much narrower and in other ways much larger than this question suggests. It deals with Ireland, but not just with the government, but also with other political actors. And this will be presented by Stefan Telle of the EUI. Finally, we'll have a joint paper by Lisanne de Blok and Catherine de Vries from the Free University of Amsterdam and Bocconi, who will look at the citizen level. And from what I understand, this will be presented by Catherine in the final presentation of this first session. So without further ado, I suggest that we turn over to Marta for the first presentation.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much for organizing this. I will start sharing my screen with the presentation. Great, so thank you very much for the organizer for putting together this online panel. Of course, it would have been much nicer to be in Florence, but we'll have to make do with this. So the paper I'm presenting today is called Party Views on Differentiated Integration, and it is co-authored with Richard Bellamy and Sandra Kröger. So in recent years, we have very much seen the growth of true parallel trends in the European Union. On the one hand, we've seen the rise of contestation in the EU, and in response to this constraining the census, we've also seen an increasing use of forms of differentiated integration. So DI broadly refers to a process whereby certain laws and policies are not uniformly applied across all EU member states, and it's frequently approached as a way of reconciling the economic, social, and cultural heterogeneity of member states while accommodating political disagreements amongst their governments concerning how far and in what ways the EU should integrate in the future. It's also a growing field of research, and most of the work has focused primarily on conceptualization of DI, theoretical and empirical accounts of when and why it happens, analysis of concrete instances of differentiated integration, and to a smaller extent, normative works on its form and desirability. In our part of the research project, we focus specifically on how political parties evaluate DI. And the paper I'm presenting today is based on the preliminary analysis of the interviews we carried out. And we look specifically at the reasons underlying their support or opposition to the process. The key findings that we have are that party actors rely on a series of normative and pragmatic arguments to defend or oppose differentiated integration, and that while support tends to be pragmatic and qualified, opposition is usually grounded in normative concerns, which suggests that perhaps DI should be approached with some caution. So if we look at the literature on the desirability of differentiated integration, we will usually find two types of arguments to either support or oppose it: pragmatic arguments and normative arguments. So in terms of the pragmatic arguments that are brought forward to suggest that DI is actually a very good idea are, for example, that it can facilitate further integration when moving together is not possible, or that it can also work as a veto buster by creating centripetal dynamics that foster further uniform integration. From a normative perspective, it has been argued that differentiated integration can accommodate diversity and respect national democratic choices, but also that it can foster equality by acknowledging that universality of rules may deepen inequality rather than foster convergence. Of course, there have also been arguments against differentiated integration. So from a pragmatic perspective, it can actually threaten the effectiveness and unity of the European Union by creating a fragmented legal order. And it can actually entrench divisions and have a centrifugal effect. So this is very much what we've seen with Brexit, that differentiation eventually led to leaving the Union. From a normative perspective, we could also consider that it damages certain key principles within the Union, such as solidarity and equality, and that it can actually create forms of domination where a certain group of member states is stronger in voice than the rest of them. So these are all plausible arguments, but they do reflect primarily the concerns of scholars of EU politics. So what we want to see in this project is really, we want to refocus our attention on the arguments that those who increasingly take decisions on differentiated integration and who have to develop positions on it bring forward to motivate their views, and specifically we focus on political parties. So why do we look at political parties? There are two main reasons why we think that these are the actors that we should be speaking to. The first one is because, in spite of the proclaimed decline of party democracy, parties still remain the fabrics through which ideas must pass in order to enter or influence governmental policies. The second reason is that political parties are still first-order providers of cues for citizens, especially on topics that remain quite complex, such as differentiated integration. So this is why we think that it's very important that we understand how they approach DI. So in the paper that I'm presenting, we draw on 22 semi-structured interviews. So this is out of a total of 34 that we are we've either done or I'm still doing a few more, with party actors who are familiar with their party's position on EU affairs. So these are typically MPs in European Affairs Committees, international secretaries, EU advisors, and MEPs. And we contacted all parties who received at least 5% of the vote in the most recent EU or national elections in Austria, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Portugal, and Romania. And in this paper, I don't really look at Portugal because we didn't have transcripts available at the time of writing. It's a purposive sample of countries which were considered uniquely well suited to provide us with an overview of key cleavages in the EU, which could be expected to influence views and understandings of DI. So in fact, they vary by wealth, levels of Euroscepticism, and positioning within the EU, both in terms of geography and in terms of, sort of center-periphery dynamics, which are all factors that we know tend to inform views of European integration, and we may therefore expect to have an impact on how they think about DI. The analysis we adopted a qualitative and interpretive approach. So interview transcripts were first read, and respondents were sorted in two categories, so opponents and supporters. This is a fairly stylized distinction. They all tend to present much more nuanced views, and I will refer to those in the presentation. But it also made sense to try and separate them as much as possible to really bring out the key features of support and oppositions. And then after dividing them in these three groups, the transcripts are analyzed in full to identify common views and concerns. So what did we find? So out of our 22 respondents, they were actually nicely divided in two equal sized groups. So 11 were more in favor of differentiated integration. And out of them, 8 came from richer and older member states, so Austria, Denmark, and Germany. In terms of the reasons they brought forward to support differentiated integration, many of them suggested that it really provided a way forward where uniform integration was not possible. They also suggested it could work as a veto buster and as a way to pioneer new measures, which would then be applied uniformly. And for many, it was also a way to foster unity and facilitate convergence and keep the union together. So one Hungarian respondent, he's a policy advisor, really said that for him, having the EU in place, rather than risking fragmentation or losses like Brexit, was really good for everyone. And he followed this up saying that he did not really think that it was fair for certain member states to block integration when others wished to go forward. In terms of the more normative reasons, these were raised by 9 out of 11 respondents. And these really centered around the idea that differentiated integration can protect the diversity of EU nations and their national traditions. So it's a way to adapt to the diversity of EU contexts. And they can be responsive to national democratic choices, especially when you have countries that do not wish to go further in integration. So perhaps one of the most enthusiastic respondents we had on this line was an advisor from Denmark, who really thought that there needed to be flexibility in the European Union, because if one country has a majority in the parliament to go in one direction, this flexibility should be there, because you should not be able to impose rules on countries where there is no majority in their parliament to go that way. All of our supporters, however, also acknowledged that differentiated integration had its limits. And so many of them viewed it as a process that should be used within clear guidelines and limits. And for about half of the respondents, it actually appeared to be a second best solution. So a typical line of argument was, look, if we could have things our way, we would be all integrating further, we would be going in a federal direction. Perhaps, but since this is not possible, we have to work with what we have, and differentiated integration is a relatively pragmatic solution in that sense. In terms of what the opponents of DI said, this is again the remaining half of our respondents. 7 of them came from new and poorer member states. And in terms of the reasons that they brought forward, from a pragmatic perspective, they stressed how it risked diluting the content of the European integration process, and how it could undermine European unity by questioning its nature as a community and a rules-based order. So one MEP from Hungary told us that he didn't think that DI was a great idea. I think it's the first step in the direction of a weakening of the European Union, or the European Union falling apart. And he also expressed frustration at the idea that one could join a club and then try and change the rules. So he used a football metaphor, saying if you enter a football game, you are going to follow the rules. You can't come in and say, I'm going to do something else. He said, if you want to do something else, you're going to play hockey instead. In terms of the more normative reasons that they brought forward, they suggested that many of their pragmatic concerns were actually underpinned by more normative worries. So typically they were worried that DI would harm solidarity by creating opportunities for free riding and cherry picking. And all of the opponents of DI actually were concerned that it would diminish the equality of EU citizens by creating Class A and Class B citizens. Finally, there was a concern with domination, and that DI could result in exclusion against one's will, and that it did limit democratic oversight. So one German respondent here told us that if he was talking about enhanced cooperation, and he viewed it as an instrument of the most powerful, bigger states who use this as a way to initiate things, which will then be pretty much forced upon the rest of the union. Respondents also acknowledged, however, even the opponents acknowledged that there could be some positives to DI. So typically they acknowledge that it could be potentially useful in resolving deadlock and facilitating the integration of new member states, or accommodating member states who would not be able to participate otherwise. So one Danish respondent, for example, viewed it very much as a necessary evil. He did not appreciate DI. He thought it was very bad, but the alternative was even worse. So in many ways, there was also a fairly pragmatic approach in some of the opponents' voices. So briefly to conclude, we've seen that parties rely on both pragmatic and normative arguments to support DI. And these, the range of views that they express mirror to significant degrees the debates in the existing scholarly literature on differentiated integration. What's most interesting is that pragmatic arguments appear to be most important for supporters of differentiated integration. But while some of them saw it as a positive development, for most it really appeared to be a compromise that would make it possible for EU integration to go ahead. Opposition to differentiated integration really came from a more normative standpoint, with actors highlighting the damaging effects that it could have on key values of the European Union. So they didn't present it as something that was impractical, that was going to create legal chaos, but something that would really harm the fundamental values of the EU. So overall, and this is something that we're going to be looking a little bit more in the next interviews, it does suggest so far that DI should be approached with some caution, because pragmatic considerations may not really be able to override these forms of more normative opposition. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have later in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Marta. Just to let you know, I was advised that there's a small mistake in the program. So in the program, it says that this panel should run until 12:30. Actually, it will only run until 12. Yeah. So just so you know when to order your luncheon. Yeah. And we'll now move on to the second presentation by Stefan, please.
Hello, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I will start sharing my screen with you. Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk a little bit about our research on the question of what do governments think about differentiated integration. I'm saying our research because the research behind this presentation was very much a collaboration of more than 30 contributors. We are expecting to have 27 member state reports written by national experts by the end of June, by the end of this June, which also means that we do not really have these reports at the moment. So my presentation will mainly focus on how we conducted this research and also show you some first preliminary findings from a few selected countries. The presentation is structured as follows. I first want to let you know what we were actually interested in, what we were researching together. Then I want to share with you the data sources we used to answer our questions. After that, I would like to give you a very short overview over the methods we have used, and then hopefully quickly come to the results that we have so far. And at the end, also some very tentative conclusions. Okay, so what were we interested in? We have already heard in the first presentation today that differentiated integration is becoming a more important part of the European Union. Perhaps Schengen and the monetary union are the most famous examples of this, but we also see opt-outs in defense policy, justice and home affairs, opt-outs from the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We have seen increasing use of enhanced cooperation, especially after 2010. and we have seen that there is now, we have PESCO. So there's a lot of differentiation actually happening, but what we don't know much about yet is what governments actually think about the issue of differentiation. So we posed two different questions. On the one hand, we first wanted to know, do governments actually talk about differentiation at all? How much do they talk about it? Because if they don't talk about it, that would also be a finding, but we wanted to first establish, do they talk about differentiation? And then when they talk about differentiation, what do they actually say? What is their position about differentiated integration? Now, how did we do that, and what did we look at? We looked at government discourses as we found them in 6 different categories of documents. These categories of documents were chosen to reflect a wide variety of contexts, both national and European, in which governments may reasonably be expected to talk about differentiation. And our document collection focused mainly on the period between 2002 and 2020. And I would briefly go through these documents to give you a feeling of why we chose them. First of all, we looked at government programs, simply for the fact that we wanted to see if differentiated integration comes up as one priority of governments, or do governments talk about differentiation at all in these types of strategic documents. And then next we looked at a number of different speeches by prime ministers, both in national context and in European context. So we looked at first speeches, then we looked at speeches that prime ministers held at the beginning of the country taking over the council presidency, to see if DI was on their agenda during the presidency. We looked as a most likely place to find references to DI in speeches on the future of Europe in the years 2017 and 18 in the context of the Commission initiated debate on the future of Europe. And we thought that this is a most likely place because the Commission white paper on the future of Europe obviously had a scenario on differentiation. And then we also looked at European Council statements by prime ministers to see whether or not DI was on the agenda. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we looked at parliamentary debates and debates in European affairs committees to see how DI was debated in the day-to-day politics. So how did we look at these documents? We actually used a mix of different quantitative and qualitative methods, and there were 2 reasons for that. We used a mix of different methods because we wanted to triangulate and validate our results by using different methods. And then we used basic methods because we had to make sure that the analysis could be conducted by more than 30 contributors in 27 different member states. So specifically what we did when we look at the salience of differentiated integration is that we counted keywords. We created lists of keywords related to differentiation and we counted them. We did this both manually and automated. And for the automated part, we used the free software Voyant tools. Then moving on to the positions of governments on differentiated integration, we manually coded each instance where a keyword on differentiation was mentioned in one of the documents we looked at, and we looked at whether this reference was positive, neutral, or negative. For the coding, we used the software QDA Miner, and both these software solutions are freely available, at least in their light version. And in addition to that, to validate our findings, we also engaged in close readings of key documents to see how keywords were used in context and to get an overall feeling of the salience and position of governments in these documents. And after doing so, we applied one holistic grade to each of these documents, reflecting the extent to which DI is being talked about and also what position a government takes. And that allowed us to calculate averages on salience and positions for different categories of documents. So now moving on to the keywords we used. We established 3 different levels of keywords because we wanted to distinguish between more abstract debates on differentiated integration on a conceptual level, where governments may think about what the nature and consequences of DI may be for the European integration or for the member state. And then also on the other hand, we wanted to see how governments talk about differentiated integration in more specific policy areas. So we distinguished 3 levels, and the first level was DI models, for which we subdivided into 2 models. On the one hand, a model for Europe of different speeds, and on the other hand, a model for a Europe of different endpoints. On the second level, we researched DI mechanisms, and here we used DI mechanisms through which differentiation is happening. And here we focused on the mechanisms of enhanced cooperation and opt-outs. And we have not included keywords for 2 other mechanisms through which differentiation is happening, which are inter-se agreements and external agreements, because these keywords would have been too vague to operationalize them. And on the third level, we also looked at 21 different instances of differentiated integration, such as the financial transaction tax, PESCO, or the fiscal compact. So these are the 3 levels of keywords that we have looked at in our analysis. And now I'd like to share with you some of our findings. And as I said, this is very much work in progress. We will receive most of the reports only at the end of this month. So these findings are based on a selection of draft reports only. But first, I would like to show you some findings we have on DI models. And specifically here you can see to what degree there was a debate in parliaments and in parliamentary committees. And as you can see over time, between 1990 and 2020, DI was not really a very salient issue. DI models were not really very salient, perhaps a little bit more so in Ireland, where you can see that mentions of DI models in 2008 and 2017 go up to 80 specific mentions, but not very salient. Another thing that you can see here is that there are no clear trends in the development of salience and DI models. Rather, you can see that salience is peaking in specific instances. So in the case of Slovenia, you can see that 2004, when the country joined the European Union, there's a peak. In the case of Ireland, you can rather clearly see that there are peaks around treaty changes, for example, in 2008, the Lisbon Treaty. And then finally, for all 4 countries, you can see that there are peaks in 2017 when the Future of Europe debate was initiated. Then we can also break down these trends into the distribution of individual keywords per country. We can do this for every year and each country. So we can also see changes over time in the discourse of individual countries. And what stands out here is that the actual term differentiated integration, for example, is used very, very rarely. Governments rather use terms such as core Europe, 2-speed Europe, multi-speed Europe, or 2-tier Europe. And what you can also see here, hopefully, is that the discourses are somewhat different in different countries. And here you see the summary for the entire period that we have analyzed, but as I said, we can also do this for each year individually. Then we did the same type of analysis for mechanisms of differentiated integration. And for Ireland, again, you can see clearly peaks around treaty changes in 2008, 2002, 1997. And if you look at Slovenia, you can see that there's some kind of tendency to talk more about these mechanisms after 2010. And that is mainly debates about enhanced cooperation.
Stefan, can you please wrap up? You've run out of time.
Okay. I would I'm sorry, I will try to wrap up. We have done the same analysis for mechanisms, instances, and finally also on positions where we coded negative, neutral, and positive statements. We are illustrating these statements also with quotes from both governments and positions. And finally, we are summarizing for each instance of differentiation, whether or not a government is participating or not. And we have a illustrative reference to illustrate this. I guess I've run out of time, but thank you for your attention, and I'm curious to hear your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Stefan, for giving us an introduction to the country reports that will be prepared in the context of InDivEU. And for the final presentation, I turn over to Catherine.
Great, thank you so much. Let me see. Are you seeing the screen now, or?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for organizing this. I also would like to have been in the EUI to meet you all and to discuss this, also to illustrate that actually part of why Lisanne and I started to frame this paper in this way was a kind of a casual talk with Frank about my previous book of differentiated integration. At the end, I tried to kind of think about how in terms of the EU could deal with preference heterogeneity, and then suggesting some forms of differentiated integration. And then Frank would say, well, that would be very interesting to study more in depth in the public. Hence we got, you know, integrated into this project, and this is also part of that of that project. So I'm very interested in that. Note that this is a very draft. We have done so far a work package where we've made an inventory of what is there when it comes to public opinion. We've also been integrating into the government positions work package that Stefan just outlined, and has done amazing work on coordinating. That's also important to say. What we try to do here is to give a little bit of a sense of what is there in terms of public opinion. How can we make sense of it? It's very descriptive and mapping. And we are now in the process of developing, well, there's one part of it that has a survey of itself that Lorenzo and Bridget did from the EUI. But we're now in the process within the project in the fall to set up our own surveys, to also do experiments. And this is a bit of the kind of backdrop of maybe the direction we want to go. And we're also liaising with Dirk Leuven, who is doing a work package in the other consortium, who is also doing public opinion. So hopefully we're not going to reinvent the wheel in different projects. And I have to say that Lisanne de Blok, who is, this was also an event to kind of champion our postdocs, who is the postdoc on this particular work package, has done an amazing job in kind of helping to also first outline what's there in terms of public opinion, and also think hard about how to move forward, as is Simon Hicks, who couldn't be here today. So the context, right? We've already talked about it. It's differentiated integration. It has increased, and at least also the scientific discussions about it have increased. Maybe not so much how governments talk about it, as Stefan was outlining, but at least in terms of the salience that it's gotten within EU studies. And here in this particular paper, we don't look at external differentiation. This is definitely something that's on the cards and that we're interested in, but we focus primarily on internal differentiation, and then on the basis of work of many of the people here in this virtual conference, we differentiated between vertical DI, so forms of what we talked about, multi-speeds Europe, differentiations across member states of how the acquis is implemented or accepted. On the other hand, of horizontal DI, which is heterogeneity within policy areas, and that distinction will come back. And we also start off a little bit from this perspective that's also been kind of informing my thinking along this, and Lisanne's as well, that DI is often posed as a solution to accommodate heterogeneity, and I think Marta already outlined that very well. And just like Marta, I think this paper will also urge some caution on that. So in that way, it fits to what was said before. But interestingly, we don't know so much about public preferences towards DI. And an interesting element that we're going to think about, well, you could think of DI as a way to deal with heterogeneity, but what about those people that actually want it came up a little bit in Marta's presentation as well, who want to move further, right? So it might be this pragmatic solution, but we also might alienate another segment of the population. We might call them the Macronites or so on, right? If that actually want to push integration forward. So to what is this is a mixed bag. So this curse and blessing in the title kind of refers to that, and we'll come back to that. So the aims of the paper is just to map public preferences for DI on the basis of the existing evidence, to investigate also the drivers, the determinants of those preferences, and ideas about how we can move that forward are also very welcome. And then we want to specifically focus, because the heterogeneity that's often talked about, I saw Benjamin, who's also Leerut, who's also in the call, has done quite a lot of work already on the aggregate level, but we wanted to kind of delve into the kind of within member state discussion about how there's different groups that want different things from the EU, and could differentiation also help with that, right? So really this kind of difference between more Eurosceptic and more pre-EU citizens. So I think the significance of this is already outlined. Well, the outcomes within the EU has diverged very much. There's a lot of heterogeneity, and actually some people suggest that economists and so on, that it's actually increased rather than decreased across time. And this also has left an imprint on public opinion. We saw it, for example, of the last Eurozone crisis and the solutions, the refugee crisis that's kind of outlined, but it kind of, sets up a little bit of a challenge for the EU to kind of reconcile radically different views about scope and depth of integration that exist across and within member states. But at the same time, of course, the problems are mounting, so public support is needed for the survival of the project. And what the picture that emerges from this paper, as it does almost from anything that we work on in public opinion, it's complicated. So it's not as easy to kind of have a fix, right? And we wouldn't maybe expect that, but nonetheless, I think it's important to highlight that differentiated integration is not some kind of silver bullet, but also brings a lot of issues in and of itself. So just because, it's quite a descriptive paper, I'll just jump straight into the data, and also for the sake of time. So we've relied on Eurobarometer data since 2004 and 2018. It has the longest time span on which we can look at public preferences towards differentiated integration, but we all know that the Eurobarometer, of course, has limitations in the way that it's not a academic-based survey of public preferences towards differentiated integration, but it's an instrument used also by EU policymakers. So it asks particular questions quite well, and other questions are not addressed. We also then updated with a recent YouGov administered by the EU or planned by the EY in 2020, where we actually have horizontal and vertical differentiated integration asked at the same time, which is not necessarily the case in the Eurobarometer. It has different batteries in different time points. So the public preferences that we're interested in is vertical DI, so kind of multiple speeds, opt-outs, all kinds of different terminologies that Stefan also referred to that are also used in public opinion surveys. And then we're interested in horizontal DI, just in the degree to which one wants to move up or move down certain levels of policy authority at the EU level. And think of free movement, single currency enlargement, common foreign security policy, common migration, energy, single market, trade, right? So a lot of different policy areas. So kind of a first takeaway from the paper is when we note that the questions are not always 100% the same. So we have to be a bit careful, but nonetheless, they capture the same kind of multi-speed, two-speed idea. When we map across time in the best way that we can of using the surveys to match, we actually see slightly of an increase in support for general DI when we are thinking about a two-speed Europe. And also interestingly, and that's this kind of green or light blue line, or however you see it on the screen, is that we also see a decrease in the number of people expressing a don't know to that question. So it seems that also public opinion is more crystallized, which also might be a reflection of that parties are talking and elites and the media is talking more about differentiated integration than it's done in the past. So although we didn't want to take the thunder of Wojciech, who's going to write a paper more on regional differentiation, regional divides, and this is really about individual level variation, that's the scope of this paper, but we just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the regional distribution of preferences for vertical DI. So, and what you see, and then I'm kind of Thomas Vincent and Benjamin Leerut have done also some of this work. You see it now also increasingly in kind of Eastern European member states, or in some of the Fisher-Red countries, but also in some more richer Northern European member states, right? And there's quite some variation across countries, but that variation is pretty stable across time. So this is 2008, 2018. So that's kind of interesting. But there is interesting regional variation to exploit, which Wojciech will do in the future. So then we go and we have this question about, like, to what extent do you think that things in the EU are moving to the right direction? That's also been cross-validated with other measures of EU support. And we look at the distribution of preferences of those people who think that the EU is moving in the right direction, wrong direction, and neutral direction, and their preferences for vertical DI. So we see a slight decrease. People who think that the EU is moving in the wrong direction are slightly less supportive of vertical DI. But we'll come back to that. Don't make too much out of this yet. Then when we look at horizontal DI, sorry, I have to move this. Now the screen here of the move it to the top. When we look at preferences for horizontal DI, we see overall that those people who say that the EU is moving in the wrong direction show a lower bar of support for more policy authority of the EU in particular areas. But it's interestingly very concentrated among the single currency and also future enlargement, right? So that's an interesting observation, but we see differences between those who are more pro-EU versus those who are more anti or more skeptical. Let me see what, yeah. So then so that's a little bit of the mapping, right? So we see a slight increase, we see differences between Eurosceptics more pro-EU, we see some differences across countries that we don't necessarily are going to delve into this paper. Then thinking about the drivers of vertical DI. So we've looked at a couple of things that are, that have to do, unfortunately in these surveys, there's not as much for those who are more interested in identity explanations. There's not much in these surveys that we can exploit. So we'll focus more on things like education, socioeconomic status, and ideology. So we find that the drivers of vertical DI, that support for vertical DI increases with education. It increases with those who say that they have trouble making bills. We can also measure that socioeconomic status in a different way. And the unemployed are more supportive of vertical DI. We find that it also increases with moving to the right, and the ideology element I'm going to come back to later on, and that there's an overall increase when people are more Eurosceptic. Of course, in the next stages, we want to do some more experimental evidence, because of course there's some questions about causality here, right? But I'll leave that for now. So we also wanted to map a little bit in what the relationship is between being more pro-EU or neutral vis-a-vis about the direction of the EU. So being more supportive, being more neutral, vis-a-vis saying that the EU is moving in the wrong direction, being more Eurosceptic, and how across time this correlates with preferences towards vertical DI. So we see that the Eurosceptics are always much more negative than the kind of pro-EU camp. However, actually this difference in recent years has decreased a little bit. It'd be very interesting to see in kind of now in the crisis, the kind of crisis periods is where it's quite strongly diverged, right? So it'll be interesting to see how it also now with the recovery plan, etc., how that's going to evolve when we have our own surveys that we're going to do in the fall or in the spring of next year. So we then replicate some of this evidence with this more recent survey that was done in the spring of 2020, where we have both vertical and horizontal DI preferences at the same time, and we can really look at we can really compare EU supporters and Eurosceptics, as well as other explanations and drivers of DI. We do a couple of things in the paper, but here I want to specifically focus on the interaction between being Eurosceptic or being Euro-positive and having a more right-wing or a more left-wing ideology, right? So what we see is that indeed we see that an interesting differentiation to emerge, so that more Eurosceptic citizens are more supportive of horizontal DI, where they're more skeptical of vertical DI, and the reverse is true for pro-EU people. But we see that ideology mediates this effect quite substantially. And that is also something that we wanted to look into. In the next stage of the paper, we wanted to also look at party supporters, because it was already mentioned before that maybe DI is a quite complicated issue, so that maybe this is reflecting that people are looking at cues, right? But we haven't been able to look at that in this particular Eurobarometer data, but the YouGov data allows us to do that. And in future work, we actually would like to see how kind of framing and party position taking matters for how people think about DI. So what the role, bringing the kind of party element of this working package and the government element of this working package and carrying it through public opinion. So just kind of in this kind of first mapping exercise, we find that on general, if we don't look beneath the surface, that the EU public has become more supportive of DI. However, we see clear differences between vertical and horizontal DI, which is also important because it's a distinction in the literature, which seems to also be important for public opinion. Vertical DI is more popular amongst pro-EU segments of the population, maybe kind of to deal to keep as much of the acquis together, but just to have different countries go a slightly different way, while horizontal DI, having different levels of EU authority at different policy areas is much more popular amongst Eurosceptics. We also find that ideology plays a role. So if you're more pro-EU and you're left-wing, then there's much more support for vertical DI. If you're a skeptic and right-wing, there's much more support for horizontal DI. So it illustrates a little bit that certain citizens are still, the preferences in DI really reflect that people want different things of the EU, which we know, but also want the EU to deal with this in a slightly different way. So maybe for Eurosceptics, it's a way to kind of, get some of the things they want at the European level and not integrate on others. Whereas for pro-EU citizens, it will be, well, let some member states go their own way. And, still the majority of member states can, closer to that elite kind of discussion that Marta outlined, right? So that's kind of quite interesting. So, this is a first mapping, but I think that there's some interesting patterns that come out, but I think we want to, like Marta, also kind of urge some caution that maybe differentiated integration, might be a blessing to signal responsiveness to some Eurosceptic parts of the population, but the same level of horizontal differentiated integration would actually decrease support, could decrease support amongst more pro-EU segments. So it's a very kind of difficult trade-off and balance to make also when it comes to public opinion. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind when we talk about also the normative desirability and the legitimacy of DI, to not keep it, to not forget that this might have very differential effects on citizens. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. So before I give my brief initial comments to these papers, I'd just like to remind you, if you'd like to enter the discussion, ask a question, please use the public chat. It's enough if you just write down your name. Don't have to actually write down the question that you want to ask. And I will, after my comments, then ask you to speak up and ask your questions. Okay, so to my comments on these papers, I mean, as I've said in the introduction to this panel, I think all of these papers are really breaking new ground, moving into uncharted territory. Research on the eye has really focused on, let's say, on the EU level, hasn't really opened up the black box of domestic politics, public opinion, parties, and government positions. So it's great to see that we're moving in this direction and really filling this blank spot. So having said that, I'll make a few comments on each of the papers, and I will conveniently refer to them as the party, the citizens, and the country paper. So let me start with the party paper presented by Marta, which gives us exploratory interview-based analysis of party assessments of differentiated integration. I think it covers a good variation of parties and countries in this exploratory research. What it does show really nicely is that party positions reflect to a large extent the pro and contra arguments that we find also in the academic debate on differentiated integration. And I think the structured interviews that you conduct are a great method to really get at the arguments behind the party positions and the reasoning behind that. Going forward, I would like to push you in the direction of providing a bit more structure to the party analysis, and also to move in the direction of triangulation. So on the structure, how do these positions and arguments you find relate to party ideology? Left, right, Galtan, pro, anti, European integration. Also, is there any kind of association with mainstream party versus fringe party positions? Or do you actually find that the argumentation is structured by country rather than party differences? The paper mentions such associations in passing, but not really in a systematic way. And I also think the paper could start with a more theoretical section, specifying a few theoretical expectations along these more structural lines. And they would also allow you to say a bit more about the representativeness of your country and party selection, and maybe fill some empirical gaps if you find that you haven't really covered the entire party spectrum or the relevant country differences. On triangulation, of course, I mean, with any such exploratory interview-based study, you may face questions about the reliability of your findings. Most parties are represented by a single interviewee. So what happens if you ask another party representative? Would you really get the same kind of arguments and answers? Could you check the interviews against other sources, such as manifestos, speeches, parliamentary debates? And I think a very nice data source to check your findings against would actually be the country reports that are also being prepared in our project, and which will also give you some information on the party positions, for instance, in parliamentary committees and debates. And finally, I think the paper might benefit from a more critical discussion of the normative arguments put forward. I think some of them sounded quite strategic and self-serving, rather than being really based on a normative foundation. So moving on to the citizen paper presented by Catherine. So here I think it has great coverage in terms of countries and time points, using the data that is out there, which is limited, as we know. Also good to see that you are preparing new surveys that I think will dramatically enhance the quality of the data that we will get on public opinion. So one point I want to make is more of a terminological one. I was initially a bit confused by your use of the terms vertical and horizontal differentiation. At least the way you use these terms is not how Dirk Leuven, Bertolt Rittberger, and I introduced these concepts. That is, vertical differentiation, the way we use it, really refers to variation in levels of integration between policies, whereas horizontal differentiation refers to variation in member state participation across policies, and you're using it the other way around. So that's just a matter of clarification. Yeah. So I think the main and very interesting finding that you have is that Eurosceptics tend to favor differentiation in the level of policy integration, but are skeptical towards differentiation in country participation. But I guess this finding depends quite strongly on the wording of the survey question. So if you ask Eurosceptics whether they are in favor of waiting with new integration until everybody is on board, as the Eurobarometer does, you're of course likely to get a positive answer, because that means the process will slow down further into integration. I mean, if you ask them about differentiated integration in the way of, would you be in favor of countries to opt out of integration that they don't like, you would probably also get a positive answer on this. So I think whether it's positive or negative really depends on how the question is worded, and I think this is something you should take into account when interpreting the results. So 3 suggestions for moving forward. First, I found that some of the variables and the corresponding findings are not really theoretically motivated. So what is the expected relationship between, say, age, unemployment, and income on the one hand, and attitudes towards differentiated integration on the other? I think it's not that straightforward what we should expect there. Second, I think that sociotropic assessments, that is how respondents evaluate the situation of their country, would be interesting to have. I'm not sure whether the data is really there, but I think it would be great to check that. And finally, and relatedly, while it's fine in this first paper to use country fixed effects, I think you should do more with the country variation in the future. For instance, interact the individual attitudes with the country fixed effects, introduce random effects, or estimate multi-level models, because I think a lot of the variation will actually be at the country level, and it would be actually nice to bring that in, rather than to factor that out. Finally, on the country paper, which in the version that I received is an in-depth country study of Ireland, which, however, serves as a model for further such country reports. I was really amazed on how detailed and rich this report is. And I think as we will see more of these reports, they will be quite illuminating for everyone not familiar with specific national debates, and offer a lot of ground for comparison. And I think it's good that you have developed such a standardized template for the country reports, because that will facilitate comparison afterwards and will be a great data source. So that said, of course, there can also be an overabundance of detail, and I was a bit overwhelmed actually by the multidimensional data on salience in the first part. Now in the presentation, I think you found a good way already to simplify, structure that a bit more, and I think this would be welcome for the country reports too. After all, I think that the positions and arguments are the most interesting part of the report, and the salience is really just a stepping stone towards analyzing these positions and arguments. And here again, I would encourage you to structure the discussion a bit more. So again, I mean, do party ideologies and government opposition positions matter? Or is it predominantly a national interest story? That's the way I read the country report on Ireland, that party differences really didn't matter that much. And here again, I thought it actually comes through rather nicely that positions and arguments on differentiated integration can actually be quite self-serving and inconsistent. And I think this also nicely reflects back on the party paper, which deals with these arguments and positions. So, in sum, I think that all papers break important new ground, and I mean, give me a lot of optimism regarding the kind of findings that we will have at the end of our collaborative project. And I think it's really a major advance in our understanding of differentiated integration that we already see here.